Hello, I'm Rebecca Lendl, Executive Director here at the Long Now Foundation. We have a really special Long Now talk for you today with social philosopher Roman Krznaric and renegade economist Kate Raworth. Both Roman and Kate are brilliant thinkers and adventurous communicators, so today we'll get to take a deep dive with them into how we can survive and thrive by looking to the past for clues on how we can build more regenerative frameworks. Now, the breadth and depth of their work is really stunning, which means they're uncovering these dynamic insights from history, looking at peak moments when we've been capable of extraordinary recalibrations, and how these insights can open up imaginative possibilities for our futures. We'll get into some of the big civilizational aspects of their work, along with the very practical ones. So everything from how we can better understand complex adaptive systems to what we can do tomorrow. But most importantly, especially right now, their work is full of radical hope. The idea that to dislodge prevailing models, we must propose new ones, that social innovation will be as important as technological innovation in transforming the fundamental paradigms in which we operate. With that, over to you, Roman and Kate.
Hello, I'm Kate Raworth.
And I'm Roman Krznaric.
And welcome to our kitchen table. We have had many conversations here about the connections and the synergy between our work. Mine on Doughnut Economics.
And mine on the lessons of history, which I've been exploring through a recent book called History for Tomorrow. And today we're going to look at the synergies between our work, looking at a particular question, which is what Doughnut Economics can learn from history.
So let's start with one of the deepest paradigms of the economics we've inherited. It's the shape of progress. What is the shape of progress that's written into our minds by the 20th century economic inheritance? It sits behind every politician's speech and the advice of their economists, but it's never usually drawn, so I want to make it visible. It is the shape of endless growth, exponential, measured, of course, in terms of GDP, the gross domestic product of a country. And let's just note that this isn't something that's been wished only for low-income countries. No matter how rich a nation already is, its politicians and their economists tell us that the solutions to its problems lies in yet more growth endlessly. You won't have failed to notice that this goes up through the ceiling, and we have to ask, where can it possibly end? The 20th century was dominated by this shape of progress, apparently. And yet we also know so much more that this has not been the story that the 20th century left us with. We've had extraordinary levels of inequalities amplified nationally and globally. And of course, we are deeply degrading this living planet on which all our lives, all life depends. So I think it's time to start with a new shape of progress. And I have one that I can propose. Yes, it looks like a donut. This is why it's called Doughnut Economics. So seeing this image, if you think of humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of a donut-shaped picture, the kind with a hole in the middle, then the space in the hole in the middle of the donut, that's a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life. That is where people do not have the resources they need for health and education, housing, food, water, equity. These 12 social dimensions are crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals, which means all the governments in the world have already agreed that every person in the world has a right not to be left in that hole. You could say that was actually aligned with the 20th century vision. In economies that were labor intensive, if the economy is growing, then workers are getting wages, they can afford things for their families, the government can provide for essentials. But now we know too much. We know that at the same time that we use income to seek to meet our needs and wants and get everyone over this social foundation, we also start to put pressure on the life-supporting systems of this planet. We withdraw water from lakes and rivers, convert forests into farmland, build cities, burn fossil fuels, apply fertilizers. We have been putting pressure on this ecological ceiling, which is made up of the 9 planetary boundaries recognized by Earth system scientists since 2009 as what they believe are the critical life-supporting systems that make life work on this planet. From a stable climate to fertile soils, healthy oceans, abundant biodiversity, a protective ozone layer overhead. So the shape of progress is to leave no one in the hole, without overshooting Earth's limits. It's a completely different shape from the 20th century vision of this endless growth. It's about thriving in balance. And naturally we can feel it like this. If you do it with your hands, it's like a heartbeat. And I think that crucially takes us to something we profoundly know, that in our own bodies, health is about being in balance with enough food, enough water, warmth, heat, but not too much of any of these things. So we know in our bodies that health lies in balance. Can we take from what we deeply know of bodily health to planetary health and reimagine the shape of progress in the global economy? Can we enable low-income countries to meet the needs of all their people without overshooting planetary boundaries in the way that almost all nations before them have done? Could middle-income nations utterly reorient to meet the needs of their people while already coming back within planetary boundaries? Could high-income nations massively reduce their overshoot of the planet? If this is a vision for thriving in the planet, thriving, meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. The deep challenge is that we are so far from this right now, as all the red quantification in this image shows. Billions of people worldwide falling short on the essentials of life. On every one of those social dimensions, there are people falling short in countries rich and poor. And yet we've already overshot not only 6, but now 7, the scientists tell us, of these 9 planetary boundaries. So this is the starting point for transformation. And let's just remind ourselves that last century's economists never saw this. So why would we expect their economic theories to solve for this problem? Last century's politicians didn't design policies in light of this. Last century's businesses were not designed in the context of this reality, nor were last century's lifestyle aspirations, what we thought thriving means. So what kind of mindset, what kind of inspirations could give us even half a chance of getting there?
Yeah, well, for me, the donut is the fundamental framework for all my thinking, all my writing, and I believe, that it is the aspiration we should be facing as humanity. And the question I've been asking myself recently is, what is it going to take to get in there? And particularly this question is, what can history teach us about getting into that donut-shaped space? Because I believe that history is one of our most undervalued resources for thinking about the future of humanity. And we have vast amounts of the stuff to tap into. And yet if you look at our politicians and policymakers, they are so trapped in the tyranny of the now. They're looking at the next election, they're looking at the latest opinion poll, or they're crossing their fingers and hoping that new technologies will come to our civilizational rescue. And the idea of creating a culture of a longer now, which I fundamentally believe in, is partly about looking forward, far ahead in time, imagining long futures, but it also has to be about imagining deep pasts and drawing on the wisdom of past generations. And that idea of learning from history, what's sometimes called applied history, is far from new. It's an idea that goes back to the ancient Greek historian Thucydides. It can be found in the writings of the 14th century Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun. 2 centuries ago, the German writer Goethe said, "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth." But typically when we're trying to draw lessons from history, we focus on the warnings of the past, captured in that famous aphorism that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But from the research that I've done on my latest book, I've discovered just how much inspiration can be found in positive examples and stories of what's gone right, not only in the cautionary tales of what's gone wrong. Time and again, our societies and civilizations have risen up, often against the odds, to overcome crises and tackle injustices. And I think here we are in an age of extreme turbulence in the 21st century. We've got that polycrisis, we've got the climate emergency, we got risks from AI, threats to democracy. The question here is, how can we bend rather than break as we face this turbulence of our era? And I think that raises real questions, because in order to bend rather than break, clearly getting into the donut is a fundamental piece of that puzzle. And we need to understand what are the different sort of design traits our economies need to have to get into that donut-shaped space, and then subsequently ask what history can help us take us there.
Okay, but if we're going to bend, not break, I mean, to get into this, we definitely need to bend this, not break, and there's a real threat that we break. So we need to profoundly redesign our economies. Let's pick that up. I think we need to redesign them away from pursuing endless growth that is so deeply written into the political narrative still today of politicians who keep selling us this utterly outdated shape of progress. We need to move away from pursuing endless growth towards two very different dynamics of our economies. I believe we need to create economies that are regenerative and distributive by design. So just picking up the first of those, a little bit of hosepipe again. We have inherited deeply linear, degenerative industrial systems. For centuries, we have been taking from Earth's resources, taking fish from the sea, timber from the forest, fossil fuels from the ground, minerals from the mountains, sticking them in the pipe of production, making them into stuff we want, using it often only once, and then at the other end, throwing it away and spewing out the waste and pollution into the atmosphere, into the air, into the soil. This linear degenerative process, this is what is running down the life support systems of our planet. This is what pushes us daily over those planetary boundaries. So linear degenerative design is devastating to us. We have to turn this linear process into a circular or cyclical regenerative one, where resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully, collectively, more creatively, and slowly. And one of the first insights we have to make, actually, is to recognize that there are fundamentally two kinds of resources in the world, the biological nutrients and technical nutrients. So on the biological cycle, all the wood, the food, the fiber that we consume, this is nature's genius. This is how nature works. She takes the building blocks of life and makes them into things and then decomposes them and reuses them continually again and again. In nature, there is no throwing things away. There is no such thing as waste. It's all food for the next process. But we have so degraded nature's cycles that we need to regenerate, rewild, restore nature's ability to make these processes so that she can sustain the conditions conducive to life. And then on the technical side, the materials that we've made, like metals, plastics, ceramics, things that have come from nature, but we've transformed them so they won't decompose naturally if we were to return them to the earth. We have to mimic those cycles of nature by, first of all, maintaining and repairing and restoring and refurbishing and reusing and only ultimately recycling, but not throwing things away, because there is no away. So this is what they call the circular economy on both of these loops together. And by recognizing how we need to transform our industries to work with both of these loops, running on renewable sources of energy, with a lot of high-touch human care, there is work, skillful, creative work along all these processes, and deep redesign of the things we use. This would begin to take us towards a circular and regenerative economy. But it sounds beautiful, and yet right now in the world's use of materials is far less than even 10%. It's measured at something like 7% and falling. So even though we can aspire to circularity, it's got a beauty about it, and yet look at the world right now, it seems like an impossibility that we could ever actually create economies that live this way.
And this is exactly where history comes in, because I think it, in a way, opens our imaginations to a different way of doing things, different ways of doing our politics, our culture, but crucially our economics as well. And I think one place you can go to when you're thinking about the circular economy and whether it's actually feasible is to look back at the past at moments where we've created circular economies at large scale to show that it can be done. And I think a great place to go to is to 18th century Japan. I mean, imagine you're standing on the old wooden Nihonbashi bridge in the ancient Japanese city of Edo, now known as Tokyo. It's around 1750, in the era of the Tokugawa shoguns. People are chatting, laborers are pushing cartloads of rice, seafood traders are rushing across to the fish market. Now, Edo wasn't just remarkable for being a huge city of over 1 million people, so far larger than London or Paris at the time. It was also remarkable because it operated what we would today call a circular economy, where almost everything was reused, repaired, repurposed, and recycled. So Japan's policy at the time of not trading with the outside world led to shortages of precious resources like wood and cotton. So a tradition of patchwork developed, known as boro, meaning tattered rags where fragments of old cotton were sewn together into garments that were then passed down the generations, just like this one I'm wearing, which is over 100 years old. You might have a kimono, and when the cloth was worn out, you would turn it into pajamas. Then you would cut it up into nappies or diapers. Then you would turn it into cleaning cloths, and finally you would burn it as fuel. I mean, Edo at the time in the 18th century had over 1,000 circular businesses, from collecting used candle wax drippings to be remolded to down and out samurai repairing old umbrellas. I mean, traders would even pay you for your human waste and then sell it on as agricultural fertilizer. And strict timber rationing rules were also introduced to restore the nation's depleted old-growth forests. So this was actually one of the world's first large-scale examples of a low-waste, low-carbon, ecological civilization. But it's important to remember that Edo Japan was certainly not a utopia, having feudal and patriarchal inequalities. Yet 300 years on, it offers hope that we can create economies today that are driven not by the ecological blindness and chronic wastefulness of consumer capitalism, but by a deep culture of sustainability. I mean, if we were going to adopt a mindset, an economic mindset of what you could call Edonomics, we would rapidly phase out the sale of products like standard smartphones, which use over half the elements of the periodic table and are often discarded after less than 3 years. And instead, we'd introduce regenerative standards. So the only phones permitted for sale would be modular by design with easily replaceable screens and batteries, and they would have recycled metals and other materials in them. I mean, that would be pretty good, I think. But I think what's also really extraordinary about Edo is that, like many other historical examples of circular economies, like the ancestral circular economy in pre-colonial Hawaii, it also shows that it's possible to combine radical sustainability with cultural flourishing. And it gave us and gave birth to the artworks of Hiroshige, to the poetry of Basho, and to a thriving culture of sumo wrestling. I mean, what's not to like about that?
Okay, so there is a very strong and compelling historical precedent for circular economy. So I want to bring our attention to the other fundamental dynamic, right? We need regenerative but also distributive economies, because we have inherited over centuries profoundly divisive economies that capture value and opportunity in the hands of a few. I mean, over the last decade, the increasing wealth that's generated globally, more than half of that has gone to the richest 1% in the world. The number of billionaires in the world has more than doubled in the last decade. We can see these extremes of inequality widening up within countries and between. It's supercharged by the health pandemic, by digitalization. There's absolutely no chance of humanity getting into the donut, meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet in such an extraordinary unequal world. It's not feasible. So we have to address this divisive dynamic and create a world that is far more distributive by design. One in which value and opportunity are shared far more equitably with all who co-create them. And I'd say that turns out to be the whole of society. So to think about that, rather than thinking of, okay, we'll create an economy, economies throw up inequalities, we will redistribute post-tax. I don't think that'll ever get us there. We need to go deeper and think about pre-distributing by asking this question: who owns and governs the sources of wealth creation? What are the deep sources of wealth creation in society? Think of land and housing. Who owns the land in a nation? Is it owned as a speculative asset for extracting maximum rents? Likewise with the housing. Or is it owned and governed as a communal value that is used for a wider common purpose? Is the housing community owned, civically owned, run by a cooperative so that its value is held in perpetuity rather than extracting rents in the moment? Who owns the enterprises? is a country dominated by corporations owned by shareholders who want to see the highest financial rate of return quarter on quarter on quarter? Or is there also the emergence and the protection of small enterprises that are family-owned, that are cooperatively owned, employee-owned? And what we're seeing is the rise of now steward-owned enterprises. The theorist Marjorie Kelly has often talked about next generation enterprise design and the importance of putting stewardship as an ownership and governance mechanism so that we separate the actual capacity of the enterprise as a vehicle to generate regenerative and distributive outcomes from the financial demand of owners who want to extract value. Can we repurpose enterprise so that it's actually stewarded in a way that helps the world to thrive? I think we can turn to the principles of commoning, which were made famous by Ellen Ostrom, who was awarded a Nobel Economics Prize for her work on recognizing not the tragedy of the commons, which we were told since the 1960s, but actually the possible triumph of the commons. Ostrom studied many different communities that were commoning, co-creating goods and services that they mutually valued, and found that they were broadly following a set of 8 core design principles that include things like having a very strong group identity and shared understanding of their purpose, having fair decision-making inclusively, having monitoring of agreed behaviors, a fair distribution of costs and benefits, and sanctions and rewards for following those rules. So it's not a free-for-all. A commons is a carefully stewarded set of rules that mean people can work together. At the moment, I feel the commons is seen as a niche, right? It's rising as a pushback against extraordinary dominance of market centrality that's still pushing over the last century. But can the commons be recognized again more than just a niche area for small-scale organizing? Is it something actually, again, is there a historical precedence we could look to and say this has been used well, whether it's for providing for our enterprises, our land, our housing, our utilities, who runs the water, who runs the electricity? So commoning, what can history give us?
Well, let me pick up on that example of water that you just mentioned there, because when we think about where we are at this moment in history, of course, we have those multiple crises that we're facing, and one of them is around water, obviously linked to the ecological and climate emergency, the fact that so many of the world's countries will be facing or already facing water shortages, acute shortages, as well as flooding, of course. But many of the world's biggest cities are going to be facing acute water deprivation over the coming years. Big cities, Los Angeles, Cairo, Jakarta, Sao Paulo. We're already seeing water rationing in places like Barcelona, Delhi. And, you know, although we apparently live on a blue planet, only 1 in every 10,000 drops of water on this planet is fresh water, easily accessible in lakes and rivers. So I think there's a real question there. Let's take that example of water, and can we see historical precedents for managing it in a different way, kind of reflecting Ostrom's principles? And in fact, we can. And there's many places we could go to, but one place we could go to, which has a deep history of commoning, is to the Spanish city of Valencia. And if you go and visit the cathedral there, outside the west door of the cathedral, every Thursday at 12 o'clock outside the west door of the cathedral, you will see an extraordinary ritual called the Tribunal of Waters, the Tribunal de las Aguas. And you can witness this, and I've been there as a tourist, watched 8 black cloak figures walk out, and they sit in the semicircle under the stone apostles outside the west door of the cathedral. And this Tribunal of Waters, a water court which has been meeting there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And these 8 figures are democratically elected members of this court, and they're elected by local farmers, more than 20,000 farmers, who collectively manage the scarce water resources of the Valencia agricultural hinterland, where Europeans get their tasty Valencia oranges and asparagus and avocados and things like that. And because there's been water scarcity, they've had to develop rules over the years, over the centuries in fact, for how to manage the water fairly and sustainably in a multi-generational sense. So very much a long now kind of institution. And it works very, very effectively. And one of the extraordinary things about it is that you can actually go back to the annals of pre-Christian Spain. So before the 13th century, there's even records of a tribunal having met. I think what's also really interesting is that this particular institution, the Tribunal of Waters, was studied by Elinor Ostrom. If you look at her book, Governing the Commons, this was one of her primary historical examples of commoning, working through time across space. And there were many other examples she looked at too. She looked at forestry management in Switzerland. She looked at fisheries management in West Africa, but the Valencia system was one that she was quite geeky about, actually. She went into incredible detail about how those 8 rules that you mentioned actually function, the kind of fines that you would get if you took more water than you were supposed to. Because what happens in the tribunal meetings is that if there is a farmer who is violated perhaps the rules by taking maybe too much water or not looking after the irrigation canal, they are subject to a public hearing and they may get fined on the spot. So it's a really amazing instrument of commoning, showing the opposite of the tragedy of the commons. As you say, a kind of almost like not a miracle of the commons, because this happens so commonly across the world. So this is one of the ways that I think that we can see the possibilities for doughnut economics having incredibly deep historical roots. This is not pie in the sky utopianism. This is kind of commoning in action.
It's not pie in the sky, it's doughnut right here now. So there's over 50 municipalities, districts and states and cities around the world that have already embedded the concepts and principles and visuals of doughnut economics into their strategies and their policies. Let me give you some examples. So Amsterdam was the first in April 2020, right in the height of the COVID crisis. Amsterdam placed the concept of the doughnut at the heart of its ambition to have a circular city. They said we will be 100% circular by 2050. That's like aiming for the moon. We don't know how we're going to get there, but this is the goal. We'll be 50% circular by 2030. They've recently, really interestingly, in the pushback against people saying, but it's too expensive to make buildings circular, to make 100% electric transport in the city. The pushback of this is too expensive. They've started using what they call an avoided cost methodology. The question of how much will we save in the future by investing now? And when you ask that question, which recognizes that crises are coming, that costs are coming down the line if we continue as we are, you get a very different answer. And of course, it brings the long-term thinking into the now. How much will we save by investing in that future now? The city of Grenoble in France, they took on a beautiful ambition in 2022. They said, our vision is that a child who is born in this city this year, by the time they're 18 in 2040, they should be living in, experiencing and witnessing an ecologically safe and socially just city. That's one that lives in the doughnut. And they've been transforming, planting trees, making the streets absorbent of water so they're not hit by flash flooding, decarbonizing, and with a really, again, participatory, engaging with a lot of people in this conversation. I'm going to jump to California, right? Not led by the state, but by civic movement. There's an organization called California Doughnut Economics Coalition, caldec.org. They are creating their own vision of a doughnut for California. What do we look like? Where are we falling short? Where are we in overshoot? How can this be part of a new vision for our state so that we can build momentum in this direction? And then the city of Ipoh in Malaysia, a middle income country, saying, right, as we continue to develop and grow our economy, we want it to be regenerative, we want it to be distributive. What does that look like from where we are now? So this is being applied in very, very different contexts worldwide. What struck me time and time again when city councils have taken this on board, they've come back to us at Doughnut Economics Action Lab and said, hang on, if we're actually going to really become regenerative and distributive by design, we need to change the deep design of our own institutions. We're working in silos. We are caught by the inertia of our institutions. How can we actually deeply transform the way we work? So what could I be pointing them to from history to think about the way that they make decisions, the kind of governance that's actually going to give them a chance of bringing this about?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly because my background as a political scientist, I'm always thinking about what is the design of political institutions we need to make the rapid transformative changes that are absolutely essential, like getting into the doughnut. And listening to those examples of particularly the city level, regional level, municipal level, raises a real question about governance. Because I think you can have all the SDG targets and so on in the world, but if your political institutions are still caught up in very short-term cycles, if they're always looking at that kind of national sort of self-interest and not looking at wider sort of questions of planetary health, we're not going to get very far. And I think it's worth questioning here the model of democracy that we take for granted, representative government, where we put an X on the ballot sheet, every few years, and then we leave it up to the politicians to rule on our behalves. Because actually, that's only one model of democracy that you can find through history. And when writing History for Tomorrow, I was astonished at how often I came across alternative models of democracy, which I think are better suited for getting into that donut-shaped space. So, for example, one of them is known as assembly government, and it was stumbled upon by British colonialists when they went into the lands of Igbo communities in Nigeria in the 19th century, and they were looking for rulers, for leaders, for kings, and they couldn't find any. Because why? Because the Igbo communities ruled themselves through a kind of a series of neighborhood councils or village councils where men and women could make decisions together, normally by consensus. Then sometimes there were decisions delegated up to a higher level, for example, of councils of elders. And that kind of bottom-up form of democracy also has existed in other parts of history. So in Switzerland between 1524 and 1799, in a region of Switzerland called the Free State of Rhaetia, was a republic where they had this assembly-style government again, like 250 neighborhood councils would then send delegates, not representatives, more like kind of messengers, up to the next level at a commune level. And then they had a federal assembly which met a couple of times a year. And similarly, you see that kind of assembly form of democracy today in Kurdish-controlled areas of Syria, and a region called Rojava, where they have these neighborhood councils, but they've improved on the Swiss, because in Switzerland a few hundred years ago, it was only men who could participate. But in the Kurdish communities, every neighborhood council has a male and a female co-chair. And in fact, someone told me just the other day that in many parts of Rojava, in this Kurdish-controlled area, neighborhood meetings do not start until the first woman speaks, which I think is a pretty good idea. And they too have these multiple layers where they'll send delegates up to higher levels for bigger decisions about, for example, national defense. But it shows us that there's another way of doing democracy, which I think is so important when we know that our representative systems have systematically failed to deal with the climate emergency. Since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, what's happened to global carbon emissions? As you know, they've more than doubled since then. They haven't gone down, which they need to. And also we've seen a declining trust in traditional political parties and democratic institutions. And people have been turning away from that towards anti-system, far-right populist parties, of course, across America and across Europe as well. And so we need to be thinking imaginatively about what democracy can look like using history. And there's another kind of democracy we should be thinking about. So there's assembly government, and the other kind is what's known as sortition, which is the selection of public officials through a lottery system, which of course we have for our juries, but many places throughout history have had this kind of system for their regular political rule. You can go to ancient China, parts of indigenous communities in India, most famously in ancient Greece in the 4th, 5th century BC in Athens, where only men could participate in politics, so it was limited, and also no slaves and no immigrants, but they had this random selection for their equivalent of Congress or their parliament, the bull, the Council of 500, randomly selected. This was a system which lasted for a couple of hundred years, and we're seeing it actually a revival of this sortition, random selection, in today's citizens' assembly movement, what's sometimes called a deliberative wave of democracy, where these new assemblies are being set up, most famously in Ireland in 2017, when they had a citizens' assembly on the subject of abortion, where they selected around 100 citizens, randomly selected but controlled for gender balance and geography and ethnic difference and age balance, and they together met over several weekends, over several months, and they recommended to have a referendum to change the constitution and around on the issue of abortion, and that famously passed. And since then there have been hundreds of citizens' assemblies across Europe and in North America as well, particularly on the issues around climate, but also aging populations and artificial intelligence and things like that. But this is much more local, much more grassroots, much more direct than our traditional representative system. And what you find in citizens' assemblies is that everyday citizens, much more than regular politicians who are in hoc to corporate lobbyists and so on, the everyday citizens are much more likely to advocate for transformative plans for their towns and cities. Things like Doughnut Economics would absolutely make sense to your citizens who are thinking much longer term. They're thinking about the kind of city or town they want their children or grandchildren to grow up in. And, I'd love to see citizens' assemblies everywhere, like replacing Britain's House of Lords, the upper house, with a House of Citizens selected by lot. But I think that this is one of the democratic reforms where there's a lot of energy that could take us closer towards the possibility of the doughnut economy spreading even further than it already has.
So this chimes with what I've seen in some of the places that are adopting the doughnut. Like in Amsterdam, I know they held a climate assembly, and one of the elected officials in Amsterdam who was backing the assembly, she said, I want to invite the residents of this city to take the ambitious, transformative decisions that we as politicians find so hard when we're caught up in the electoral process, exactly recognizing that. So please, we give over that visioning to you to bring it back to us. In the town of Bad Nauheim in Germany, they wanted to create a Bad Nauheim doughnut, and they randomly chose 100 residents from the town, again, ensuring that it was a diversity of balance, for them to work together for several weekends to come up with their vision. So what I'm really pleased about is seeing actually many places taking this, because it's a very visual and easy to understand concept. It invites a lot of participation. It invites a lot of people's views. What does this social foundation look for us? And
I think also actually doing it like that prevents the possibility of the decision-making being captured.
Yeah.
As like a centralized political system is so open to capture by, strongmen politicians and tech guru oligarchs and so on. And if you bring the decision-making down to the local level, you're in a way insuring yourself against that kind of capturing.
So here's the thing. Over the last 5 years since we launched Doughnut Economics Action Lab to work with practitioners who wanted to put these ideas into practice, 50 local governments have embedded it. More than 90 are exploring it. There are over 60 community-based networks from Berlin to California to Brazil, all over the world, which is amazing. And yet, this is a tiny fraction of the cities, of the communities, of the places that need to be transformed. So there's that dilemma of, it's amazing, it's spreading. These are all places that are putting their own finance. No one's funding this centrally. It's all bottom-up initiatives saying, we want to bring this here. So it's spreading, but we're nowhere close to the speed and scale that this transformation needs to happen. So again, for me, this raises this question: when in history have ideas that can help bring about transformation actually been sparked to spread at the speed that we know the times demand?
Well, that's exactly one of the questions that I explore in History for Tomorrow, because I've been getting so frustrated by the way that we have these crises in society. You've got financial crashes, melting ice sheets, and yet the system doesn't seem to change. Or we've got ideas like Doughnut Economics, which are spreading, but not, as you say, at the speed and scale that we need them to. But I think one of the extraordinary things about history, I don't believe that there are any iron laws in history in that kind of Marxist sense, but there are patterns, like the pattern that Elinor Ostrom noticed about the 8 principles for successful commoning. But one of the patterns I've noticed is what I call the disruption nexus, which is a model of how change happens at speed, outside extremes like wars or pandemics, when often governments do act in quite radical ways sometimes. But outside those times, when does it happen? And the disruption nexus is a triangular model where 3 elements need to come together. First, you need some kind of crisis like heat waves or droughts or a financial collapse. The second thing you need are disruptive movements which can amplify the sense of crisis and catapult it onto the political agenda. And the third thing you need are the ideas and models around which can help provide an alternative to the existing system. And I think you could see this very much in action, for example, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of state socialism in East Germany. You had the crisis part, the crisis in the East German leadership when they were all debating about how they were going to deal with Gorbachev's reforms. Then you had the ideas, not new ideas in that case, kind of old ideas around democratic freedoms, freedom of movement, freedom of speech. And then you had the great movements, the uprisings in Leipzig in October 1989, and then the final series of uprisings in November that tipped the system. And of course, there had been protests for years in Berlin before that, but it hadn't changed the system because the 3 elements of the disruption nexus hadn't come together. And sometimes you get 2 out of the 3 elements. So the financial crash 2008, you had the crisis of the financial crash itself, You had the movements, the Occupy movement from Zuccotti Park, which spread around the world. But I think what was missing were the new economic models, like Doughnut Economics, the well-being economics, all the alternatives which have become much more central to public discussion since that time. But I think it's worth really just focusing for a minute on the importance of the disruptive movements element. And let me just give a historical example here. I mean, if you travel back to the 1820s for a moment, to the time when over 700,000 enslaved people were working on British-owned sugar plantations in the West Indies. Now, at that time, many plantation owners and financiers made remarkably similar arguments to today's fossil fuel executives to defend their actions. So they admitted that slavery, like oil and gas production, was morally questionable. But they argued, or claimed rather, that ending slavery too rapidly could easily lead to economic collapse. So instead they said that slavery should be phased out gradually over many decades, which is precisely the same excuse given by today's fossil fuel executives who display the very same foot-dragging gradualism. Now, back then the British abolition movement was organized in the Society for Mitigating and Gradually Abolishing the State of Slavery, right? The name said it all. You know, its reformist strategy of lobbying politicians and writing pamphlets was making little headway. But the turning point came in 1831 in an act of disruption which sent shockwaves through Britain, which was the Jamaica slave revolt, when over 20,000 enslaved people in Jamaica rose up in rebellion, setting fire to over 200 plantations. Now, the revolt was brutally crushed, but it sent a wave of panic through the British establishment, who concluded that if they didn't grant emancipation, they might lose the whole colony of Jamaica. And multiple studies have shown that the revolt tipped the scales in favor of abolition, leading to the Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833. And in the absence of this disruptive radical flank movement, it might have taken decades longer for abolition to enter the statute books if left in the hands of the reformist white elite. And, you know, I know that many people today are very critical of radical disruptive climate movements like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. But I think it's really important to remember that they are part of long traditions of successful disruptive movements, going back to the Jamaica rebels, to the suffragettes, to the Indian independence movement, to US civil rights activists, whose actions have indeed catapulted those issues onto the political agenda, shifted the Overton window of the policies that are deemed to be publicly acceptable at that point of time. And in a way, they've done it sometimes by breaking the rules and breaking the law. And the tragedy, I think, is that while disruptive figures from the past, like Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragette, or Martin Luther King Jr., are now celebrated in our children's school history textbooks, their modern equivalents in today's ecological movements are demonized by the press and they are criminalized by the police. I mean, it's like we've learnt nothing from history. And, you know, as you know, I'm not a naturally disruptive person. I like sitting in my little study just over there, surrounded by books, or in old libraries, doing research. But from what I've discovered in those old libraries about the power of disruptive movements, I found myself, as you know, lying on the street, blocking the roads with our teenage daughter in front of London's Parliament, exasperated at the government's glacial pace of action on the climate crisis. And, I know it annoys commuters, but our inaction is going to infuriate future generations even more. I mean, I can't think of a better way to be a good ancestor. It is too late, and I think too reckless, to leave this crisis to simmer on the low flame of gradualism. So I think that the ideas of Doughnut Economics can be spread and expanded through the power of disruptive movements. I'm not saying it's the only thing we need. We need people lobbying governments. We need people writing books and creating artworks. But we also need to have an element of disruption to create the kind of change that we need.
And actually, you're making me think of people in Melbourne. There's an amazing movement called Regen Melbourne, which was founded a few years ago in the wake of devastating fires in that city and region. And the founder said to me, we were just literally burned to the ground, our home. It made us say, this system does not work, what else? And they turned to the ideas of Doughnut Economics at that time. So it's actually a really nice example of that crisis. And then they built a movement with the donut as a concept at the heart of it. So yeah, and may we not wait for too many crises. But these ideas that we're talking about, I agree that there's Doughnut Economics, there's regenerative economics, there's well-being economies. These are the so-called new economic ideas. And of course, they sit alongside long-known indigenous economic ideas from Ubuntu to Buen Vivir to Aina Loja of Hawaii. These many ideas that they need to work together. Different people are going to be drawn to different ones as different entry points, but they are arising and emerging. And actually, I just want to come back to the concept of boundaries, because I know often when people see this donut, I've sometimes heard people say, nice idea, but don't like the boundaries. You know, if I see a boundary, I want to break right through it. And I would say to that, really? Think again, right? Some boundaries are absolutely worth breaking through, like the glass ceiling, which is a gender, a race, a class boundary for many people. Let's break through that boundary. But other boundaries are wise boundaries that actually hold and protect the conditions of life. You know, if you have a baby child, 1 month old, whose temperature goes to 40 degrees, what parent says, you go girl, break through that boundary? No parent says that. Everyone, you act to bring their temperature back within what we know is health, is life. So we understand in our own bodies the boundaries that keep us alive are essential to the conditions of life. So the donut invites us to recognize the fundamental boundaries of human rights, the fundamental boundaries of the integrity of this only known, delicately balanced living planet. Let us unleash the creativity between, right? These boundaries can unleash our creativity. That's what I'm seeing in the towns and communities and businesses that are adopting these ideas. And for me, it's seeing the peer-to-peer inspiration and the peer-to-peer permission that they're triggering each other. And that it's when people see, like the mayor of Amsterdam, when the vice mayor of Amsterdam says, of course we're going to put doughnut economics at the heart of our policy. Then other city mayors and policymakers see someone who's just like them, but already doing that thing they thought was impossible. That is a moment of permission. It's time to move. People like me are now in action. This is it. We're moving. And that's what keeps me on this, because that's where I see the possible momentum coming from.
And really, I think what I hear you saying is you're giving us a message of hope. And from what you're seeing going on in the spread of doughnut economics around the world, and I see a similar kind of hope in history in a way. I like to make a distinction between optimism and hope. You know, optimism being that kind of glass half full attitude that everything's going to be okay despite the evidence. Well, I don't think everything's going to be okay. Of course, it's business as usual. We are breaking through those planetary boundaries. We are failing to, meet people's basic social foundation needs, as illustrated in the donut there. But when I look through the past, I just see so many positive examples that it really gives me a genuine hope that it doesn't have to be this way, that we can have different kinds of economies and politics. And, for me, hope, as opposed to optimism, is all about being committed to your values and to your vision, even when the odds are against you. The great historian Howard Zinn once said that the fundamental leaps in social evolution have come from those who acted as if. And what he meant was that those who were fighting colonialism in India were fighting something seemingly impossible, a giant system, but they acted as if change was possible. And I think this is what we also have to do with the aspiration to get into that donut-shaped space. Slavoj Žižek famously said, the great Slovenian philosopher, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And it's quite hard to imagine very fundamentally different economic systems. But I think history offers us those precedents. I think what's going on with the donut today is offering us those precedents. And we have to also remember to be aware of the dangers of hopium, hope without action. This is, as you say, all about action. But I think it's also about keeping the long view and honouring this beautiful Maori proverb, Kia whakatomori te haere whakamua. I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past.
So friends, if you can imagine beyond the end of capitalism and towards perhaps the beginning of a donut economy, I warmly invite you to join us at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, where we are trying and seeking and working with pioneers, putting these ideas into practice in a contemporary economy, inspired by the ideas of history. Let's take what we can learn from that long past and make it the future.